A dying widow begged, "Please, bury my child." But when a battle-scarred freight hauler found her wagon in the snow, he couldn't do it. He buried the mother and carried the baby instead, straight into a storm that would change everything. The trail led him to a quiet mission, a widow's lamp burning in the dark, and a secret the whole valley wanted buried. Because this child wasn't just anyone's son. He carried a mark that tied him to a powerful rancher, and a forbidden marriage no one dared to speak of. Now, with gunsmoke on the wind and church bells echoing through Taos, mercy itself is on trial. Will the man honor the widow's dying plea or expose a truth that could destroy them all? One promise made in snow, one child caught between two worlds, and one act of faith that could either save a soul or start a war. What would you do if the dead asked you to keep a promise the living would kill to silence? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Through swirling snow and biting wind, James Kearney guided his mules along the lonely trail. The March storm had caught him off guard, turning what should have been an easy haul through the Sangre de Cristo foothills into a treacherous journey. His thick wool coat, dampened by the wet snow, hung heavy on his shoulders as he squinted against the white darkness ahead. The lead mule, Moses, suddenly pulled up short, ears twitching forward. James tightened his grip on the reins, trusting the animal's instincts. Through the curtain of snow, a dark shape emerged, the broken remains of a wagon, tipped precariously in a shallow gulch. "Whoa there," James called softly, bringing his team to a halt. The crunch of his boots in the fresh snow seemed unnaturally loud in the storm's quiet. His weathered hand instinctively moved to the revolver at his hip as he approached the wreck. The wagon's canvas cover fluttered weakly in the wind, torn and sagging. James lifted the edge carefully, letting out a sharp breath when he saw what lay inside. A native woman huddled beneath a thin blanket, her face drawn with fever. In her arms, she clutched a small bundle that stirred ever so slightly. "Ma'am?" James spoke gently, not wanting to startle her. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing deep brown irises clouded with pain and exhaustion. "Please," she whispered in halting English, her voice barely carrying over the wind. "My child. Bury him where he can see the sunrise." James's heart clenched at her words. He recognized the traditional beliefs woven into her request, the importance of facing east, of maintaining that connection between the living and the spirit world. The woman's gaze held his, fierce despite her weakness. "I'm James Kearney," he said, already shrugging off his coat. "Let me help you." He wrapped his coat around her and the infant, noting how she trembled with fever. The storm showed no signs of letting up, but he couldn't leave them exposed like this. With practiced efficiency, he unhitched his mules and set up a makeshift camp in the lee of a rocky outcropping. The small fire he managed to build cast dancing shadows across the snow. He'd moved the woman and child closer to its warmth, sharing his remaining blanket and offering what little comfort he could. Her breathing grew more labored as the night wore on. As James fed small branches into the flames, unwanted memories surfaced. Another cold night, another desperate vigil. His son William, barely 18, bleeding out in a field hospital at Vicksburg. The boy had looked so much like his mother, even at the end. James had buried him himself, marking the grave with his sword before rejoining his unit. The war had taken so much from so many. The woman, she'd managed to tell him her name was Taya Begay, slipped in and out of consciousness. Sometimes she would murmur in Navajo, words James couldn't understand but recognized as prayers. Other times she would clutch her child tighter, as if afraid he would be taken from her. Near dawn, her eyes opened one last time, clearing briefly as she looked at James. "Promise," she whispered. "Sunrise." Then she was gone, her hand going slack against the bundle in her arms. James sat motionless for a long moment, the weight of her trust settling heavy on his shoulders. When he finally reached for the infant, he found the child still breathing, though barely. Something fierce and protective stirred in his chest, something he hadn't felt since William. The snow had lightened by mid-morning, enough for James to begin his grim task. He chose a spot near a young cottonwood tree, where the ground wasn't too frozen to dig. The work was slow, but each thrust of the shovel felt like a prayer of its own. When the grave was deep enough, he wrapped Taya's body in his spare blanket and laid her to rest with all the dignity he could muster. He gathered stones from the surrounding area, building a careful cairn over her grave. The cottonwood's bare branches rattled softly overhead, nature's own mourning song. James stood for a moment, head bowed, thinking of all the graves he'd dug during the war. But this one felt different, not a marker of violence, but of a mother's love and sacrifice. The infant stirred in the wagon where James had placed him, wrapped snugly in clean blankets. All day, as he worked on Taya's grave, he'd wrestled with her final request. "Bury my child where he can see the sunrise." The words echoed in his mind, along with the memory of William's face, of all the young lives cut short in war and hardship. As dusk approached, painting the snow-covered hills in shades of purple and gold, James made his decision. He couldn't bury this child, not while there was still breath in that tiny body, still a chance for life. Perhaps Taya's wish wasn't meant to be taken literally. Perhaps seeing the sunrise meant giving her son a chance to grow up, to witness many dawns to come. James checked his supplies, calculating what he'd need to keep an infant alive until they reached the next settlement. He had some condensed milk, clean cloth for diapers, and enough fuel to keep them warm. It wouldn't be easy, but then nothing worth doing ever was. He lifted the baby carefully, studying the small face that already showed hints of his mother's features. "Well, little one," he said softly, "reckon we've got some hard traveling ahead of us, but I promise you'll see plenty of sunrises." The child's eyes opened slightly, dark and solemn like Taya's had been. James felt something shift inside him, like ice breaking up after a long winter. He hadn't saved William. That burden would always be with him. But maybe, just maybe, he could save this child. Using strips torn from his spare shirt, James fashioned a sling to carry the baby close to his chest, where his body heat would keep the tiny one warm. He checked Taya's grave one last time, making sure the stones were secure, then turned to his wagon and mules. The storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white. As James carefully mounted the wagon seat, baby secured against him, the clouds broke in the east. A single shaft of sunlight pierced through, catching on the snow and turning it to diamonds. It felt like a sign, like Taya's spirit acknowledging his choice. Moses and his partner stamped impatiently, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. James gathered the reins, his decision settling into certainty in his heart. He would honor Taya's wish not by burying her son, but by ensuring he lived to see countless sunrises, by teaching him about both his mother's people and the wider world that waited ahead. "Gee up," he called softly to the mules, and the wagon began to move. Behind them, the cottonwood stood sentinel over Taya's grave, its branches reaching toward the lightening sky. Ahead lay uncertainty, challenge, and hope, but James Kearney had never been one to choose the easy path. The baby shifted slightly in his sling, settling into sleep. James adjusted his coat to better shield the child from the wind, remembering how it felt to hold William when he was this small. Different time, different child, but the same protective instinct, the same fierce desire to shield an innocent life from harm. As they traveled on, the sun continued to rise over the Sangre de Cristo foothills, casting long shadows across the snow-covered trail. James kept one hand on the reins, the other resting gently on the sleeping infant. Together they moved forward into the growing light of a new day, leaving death behind and choosing life instead. The creak of wagon wheels and the steady rhythm of the mules' hooves filled the morning air. James knew the journey ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in years, he felt the stirring of purpose, of faith renewed. Sometimes, he reflected, the greatest acts of devotion came not in following the letter of a promise, but in understanding its heart. The morning after the burial dawned clear but bitter. James carefully wrapped the infant in Taya's woven shawl, its deep reds and browns still vibrant despite the journey that had brought its owner to her final rest. The baby's tiny fingers curled around the fabric, seeking warmth against the lingering winter chill. "Steady now," James murmured, checking the makeshift sling he'd fashioned across his chest. The child nestled there, protected from the wind by James's heavy coat. His mules, Moses and Abraham, stood patiently in their traces as he secured the last of his cargo. The wagon wheels creaked as they began their slow journey south toward Taos. The storm's passing had left the trail treacherous. Melting snow mixed with dark earth to create a thick mud that sucked at the wagon wheels, making every mile a struggle. James kept to the high ground where he could, but the going was slow. By midday, they'd covered barely 5 miles. The baby's first cry of hunger caught him off guard. James pulled the wagon to a halt near a clear-running creek, the water brown with spring runoff but clean enough for his needs. He'd traded for goat's milk in the last settlement, knowing cow's milk might be too rich for such a young child. "Reckon you're about ready for dinner," he said, gathering fallen branches for a fire. The infant's dark eyes watched him as he worked, solemn and trusting. James set water to boil in his battered tin pot, measuring out the milk carefully. His hands, more used to handling freight and reins, felt clumsy with the tiny glass bottle he'd bartered for. While the milk warmed, he hummed without thinking. An old war song, something about Shenandoah's flowing waters. The baby's fussing quieted almost immediately. James raised an eyebrow, studying the small face. "Like music, do you?" He switched to another tune, softer this time, and watched as tiny eyelids began to droop. The next few days fell into a pattern. Rise before dawn, feed the baby, check the mules, move as far as the muddy trail would allow. The thaw brought its own challenges. Swollen streams to ford, patches of trail where the wagon wheels sank to their hubs. James found himself talking more than he had in years, explaining each task to his silent companion. "Got to test the depth here," he'd say, probing a water crossing with a long stick. "Don't want to lose our supplies." Or, "These cottonwoods mean water nearby. Good place to rest the mules." The baby watched it all with serious eyes, occasionally breaking into a toothless smile that made something twist in James's chest. By the 4th day, their supplies were running low. The goat's milk was almost gone, and the clean cloth he used for diapers needed proper washing. James spotted smoke from chimneys in the distance, a small trading post he'd used before, run by an old Mexican trader named Manuel. The trading post was little more than a long adobe building with a covered porch, but it was a welcome sight. Manuel stepped out as the wagon approached, his weathered face creasing in surprise at the sight of James with an infant. "Senor Kearney," he called, "this is new cargo for you, no? James climbed down carefully, mindful of his precious burden. "Found his mother's wagon in the storm," he said quietly. "She didn't make it. I'm looking for somewhere safe for the little one." Manuel's expression softened. "Ah, there is a place. In Taos, the mission orphanage. A widow runs it now. Senora Dunn, Chloe Dunn. Good woman, kind heart. Takes in all children, no questions asked." Hope stirred in James's chest. "How far?" "1 day, maybe 2 in this mud." Manuel glanced at the baby. "You need supplies?" They worked out a trade. A sack of James's freight oats for milk, clean cloth, and information about the trail conditions ahead. As James prepared to leave, Manuel pressed a small bag of corn cakes into his hands. "For strength," he said simply, "the road is long." The 5th day brought warmer weather and clearer skies. James found himself watching the horizon, seeking the first glimpse of Taos. The baby had developed a slight fever during the night, making small, distressed sounds that worried him more than he wanted to admit. As the sun began its westward slide, he finally saw it, a white cross atop the adobe mission, catching the light like a beacon. Relief flooded through him, followed immediately by concern. Moses and Abraham were stumbling, pushed beyond their endurance by the difficult trail. "Just a little further," he urged them, but the mules had reached their limit. A 1/4 mile from the mission, they simply stopped, sides heaving with exhaustion. James knew better than to force them. He made camp one last time, setting up close to a small stream. The baby's fever worried him. The tiny body felt too warm against his chest. As darkness fell, the sound of church bells drifted across the valley, their soft tones carrying a promise of sanctuary. James sat beside his small fire, humming quietly to the feverish child. The familiar tunes seemed to help, as they had all along the trail. Sometime in the deep hours of the night, as the last bell toll faded, he felt the baby's body cool, the fever breaking at last. "Thank you," he whispered, though to whom, God, Taya's spirit, or the child himself, he wasn't quite sure. The infant slept peacefully now, one hand still clutching Taya's shawl. Above them, stars wheeled in the vast New Mexico sky, and for the first time in years, James felt the stirring of something he'd thought long buried. Faith, small as a mustard seed, taking root again in the soil of his heart. He looked toward the mission, its white cross pale in the starlight. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, he simply held the sleeping child, listening to the night sounds of the valley and the soft breathing that meant life, hope, and the possibility of redemption. The mules dozed where they stood, too tired even to graze. James checked their harnesses one last time, making sure they could rest comfortably. Everything else could wait until morning. For now, it was enough that they had made it this far, that the baby's fever had broken, that somewhere ahead lay help and perhaps understanding. He settled back against his saddle, the child secure against his chest, and watched the stars wheel overhead. The journey had changed him, he realized. Each small act of care for this innocent life had slowly rebuilt something in his soul that the war had shattered. Whether it was faith or simply humanity returning, he couldn't say. But he was grateful for it, grateful for the trust of a dying mother and the chance to choose mercy over desolation. The night deepened around them, peaceful and clear. In the distance, crickets began their evening song, a gentle counterpoint to the baby's soft breathing. James pulled Taya's shawl more securely around the sleeping infant, its woven patterns barely visible in the dying firelight. Tomorrow would bring them to the mission's door, but tonight, under the vast star-scattered sky, they were exactly where they needed to be. Dawn painted the Sangre de Cristo mountains in shades of rose and gold as James guided his tired mules toward the mission gate. The weathered wooden barrier stood partially open, welcoming early risers to morning prayers. A small bell tolled somewhere within the adobe walls, its clear notes carrying across the quiet valley. James lifted the sleeping infant, still wrapped in Taya's shawl, and approached on foot. His boots crunched on the gravel path, drawing the attention of a nun sweeping the courtyard. She paused, leaning on her broom as she studied the unexpected visitors. "Good morning," she called softly. "I am Sister Clara. How may we help you?" James cleared his throat, suddenly aware of his trail-worn appearance. "Name's James Kearney. I was told Mrs. Dunn might help with—" He gestured to the baby. Sister Clara's eyes widened with understanding. "Of course. Please, come in." She held the gate wider, then led him across the courtyard. Morning glory vines climbed the mission walls, their purple blooms just opening to the sun. "Wait here," she said, indicating a wooden bench. "I'll fetch Mrs. Dunn." James sat, adjusting the shawl around the stirring infant. The courtyard breathed peace, herbs growing in neat beds, the sound of children's voices singing hymns from somewhere inside, the scent of fresh bread from the kitchen. He found himself relaxing slightly, though his heart beat faster at the thought of seeing Chloe again after so many years. The sound of footsteps made him look up. Chloe Dunn stood in the doorway, one hand pressed against the adobe wall as if for support. She looked different than he remembered. Older, yes, but with a quiet strength in her bearing that hadn't been there before. Her dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and laugh lines marked the corners of her eyes. Those eyes now widened with recognition. "James?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Is it really you?" He stood slowly, mindful of the sleeping child. "Hello, Chloe." She took a step forward, then another, her skirts rustling against the flagstones. "We thought, after Vicksburg, there was no word." "I couldn't write," he said simply. "Not after Benjamin." Their shared grief hung between them. His son, her nephew, lost in the same battle that had nearly claimed James. The baby chose that moment to wake, making small, hungry sounds. Chloe's attention immediately shifted, professional concern replacing personal shock. "You have a child with you?" James explained quickly about finding Taya's wagon, the storm, the desperate journey to reach help. As he spoke, Chloe moved closer, her practiced eye assessing the infant's condition. "May I?" she asked, holding out her arms. James carefully transferred his small charge. Chloe's touch was gentle but sure as she examined the baby. "He's warm, but not feverish. How have you been feeding him?" "Goat's milk when I could get it. Water and honey when I couldn't." She nodded approval. "He's doing well considering. Let's get him properly cleaned and fed." She turned toward the mission's inner rooms, then paused. "Will you stay? There's much we should discuss." James glanced at his wagon, still visible through the gate. "Need to tend the mules first. They're spent." "Of course. Sister Clara will show you where to stable them. Come find us in the infirmary when you're done." An hour later, having settled Moses and Abraham with fresh hay and water, James followed Sister Clara's directions through the mission's cool corridors. He found the infirmary easily enough. A bright room with whitewashed walls, and windows open to catch the morning breeze. Chloe stood at a wooden table, bathing the now alert infant in a shallow basin. She looked up as he entered. "Come see something strange," she said. Carefully, she turned the baby to show his right shoulder. There, stark against the brown skin, was a birthmark shaped exactly like a feather. "I've seen this mark before," she said quietly. "Or rather, heard it described. There's a rancher north of here, Elias Broder. Years ago, his Navajo wife disappeared with their newborn son. Some said she'd returned to her people, others that she'd died in the winter storms. Broder offered rewards, but no one ever found them. James remembered Taya's last words. She asked me to bury her child where he could see the sunrise. But you brought him here instead. Chloe's voice held no judgment, only understanding. Couldn't bury another child, James admitted. Not after Benjamin. Chloe wrapped the baby in clean linen, cradling him close. Perhaps Providence guided your choice. This little one may be heir to one of the largest ranches in the territory. She settled into a rocking chair, offering the infant a bottle of warm milk. Though that brings its own complications. They sat in companionable silence, watching the baby drink. James studied Chloe's face in the morning light, noting how the years had gentled rather than hardened her. The bitter grief he remembered from their last meeting had transformed into something deeper, compassion, perhaps, or wisdom. The water wheel's broken, she said suddenly. I noticed you looking at it when you came in. We've been hauling water by bucket for weeks now. I could take a look, James offered. Good with mechanical things, always was. I remember. A smile touched her lips. You fixed my father's clock the day you asked to court me. The memory hung between them, sweet and painful at once. James cleared his throat. Best get started before the day gets too hot. The water wheel proved a straightforward repair, worn bearings, mainly, and a cracked paddleboard. James worked through the afternoon, aware of Chloe moving between the infirmary and courtyard, carrying water, hanging laundry, directing the older children in their chores. Occasionally their eyes would meet across the yard, and something of their old connection would spark between them. As evening approached, James tightened the last bolt and stepped back to watch the wheel turn smoothly in the acequia's flow. The sound of running water mixed with children's laughter from the mission kitchen, where supper preparations were underway. It's good to hear that sound again, Chloe said, joining him by the water wheel. She carried the baby, now dressed in clean clothes, his dark eyes bright and alert. Sister Clara says you're welcome to stay in the guest room tonight. The mules could use the rest. James nodded, suddenly reluctant to leave. Together they walked to the infirmary, where a small crib stood ready. Chloe laid the baby down carefully, tucking Taya's shawl around him. A lamp burned low on the nearby table, its gentle light casting soft shadows on the whitewashed walls. What will you name him? James asked. I thought perhaps Benjamin, Chloe said softly. If you wouldn't mind. James felt his throat tighten. No, he managed. I wouldn't mind at all. They stood together in the lamplight, watching the sleeping child. Outside, the mission bell tolled the evening angelus, its clear notes carrying peace across the valley. The baby, Benjamin, stirred slightly, then settled again, one small hand clutching the shawl's fringe. God works in mysterious ways, Chloe murmured. Who would have thought after all these years? James understood what she meant. The war had torn them apart. Grief had kept them separated, yet here they stood, brought together again by a child's need and a mother's dying wish. The lamplight flickered, casting their shadows on the wall, man, woman, and sleeping infant, an image of the family they might have been, might still become. The revelation of the birthmark had changed everything, binding their fates to little Benjamin's future, and to whatever justice or reconciliation might come from finding Elias Broder's lost heir. But for now, in the quiet infirmary, watching lamplight play across the crib, they could simply be grateful for the chance to begin again. Sister Clara appeared in the doorway. Supper is ready, she announced softly. Will you join us, Mr. Kearney? James looked at Chloe, who nodded encouragement. "Much obliged," he said. Together they followed Sister Clara, leaving Benjamin sleeping peacefully in the gentle lamplight, Taya's shawl keeping watch over his dreams. Dawn broke crisp and clear over the Sangre de Cristo foothills. James hitched Moses and Abraham to the wagon, while Chloe prepared little Eli for the journey north. The morning air carried a hint of pine from the mountains, mixing with the scent of fresh bread from the mission kitchen. "Sister Clara packed us some provisions," Chloe said, climbing carefully into the wagon seat with the baby bundled against her chest. She'd wrapped him in Taya's shawl, its deep red wool bright against the morning shadows. "The Broader Ranch is about 4 hours' ride, following the creek north." James clicked his tongue, and the mules set off at a steady pace. The wagon wheels left shallow tracks in the muddy road as they passed through Taos's quiet streets. A few early risers nodded greeting, a baker dusting his hands on his apron, a Mexican woman sweeping her doorstep, 2 Apache men leading pack horses toward the trading post. "Town's grown some," James observed, guiding the mules around a deep rut. "Yes, the railroad's coming soon, they say, though I wonder if that's entirely for the better." Chloe adjusted the shawl around little Eli, who watched the passing scenery with dark, curious eyes. "Mr. Browder's one of those pushing hardest for it. He has governor's ears, they say, and territorial judges in his pocket." The sun climbed higher as they left town behind, the road winding through patches of scrub oak and piñon pine. Little Eli dozed against Chloe's shoulder, while she and James shared memories of easier days, county fairs before the war, church picnics, the Christmas dance where they'd first courted. Neither mentioned Benjamin or Vicksburg directly, but the knowledge lay between them like a shadow. Near midday, they crested a rise and saw the Broader Ranch spread below them, a sprawling adobe hacienda surrounded by corrals and outbuildings. A dozen cowboys moved through the yard, some leading horses, others carrying hay bales. Even from this distance, the operation's military precision was evident. "Broader runs it like an army camp," Chloe said softly. "Everything scheduled, everything controlled. His wife, Taya, used to help in town sometimes, at the trading post. She was gentle, good with numbers. Then one winter she vanished. Broader claimed she'd run off, but there were whispers." James pulled the wagon to a stop before the main gate. A tall man with hard eyes emerged from the barn, hand resting casually near his holstered pistol. His clothes were trail-worn, but well-kept, his manner watchful. "That's Harlan Pike," Chloe whispered. "The foreman. Be careful. He fought for the Union, but the war never really ended for him." Pike approached the wagon, spurs jingling. "State your business." "Need to speak with Mr. Broader," James said evenly. "Personal matter." Pike's gaze flickered to Chloe, then narrowed at the sight of little Eli. Something ugly crossed his face. "Wait here." He turned sharply and strode toward the hacienda. Minutes stretched like hours in the yard's dust-filled silence. Cowboys paused in their work to stare, then looked away when James met their eyes. Little Eli stirred, making small sounds that echoed in the tense quiet. Finally, Pike returned. "Mr. Broader will see you. Leave the wagon here." They followed him through a cool portico into a high-ceilinged study lined with books and maps. Elias Broder sat behind a massive oak desk, his bulk filling in leather chair. Gray threaded his thick beard, and his eyes held the careful neutrality of a man accustomed to power. "Welcome to Circle B," he said, not rising. "Pike tells me you have business with me." James let Chloe explain their errand, finding Taya in the storm, her last words, the baby's distinctive birthmark. As she spoke, Broder's expression remained unchanged, but his hands tightened slightly on his chair's arms. "A sad tale," he said when she finished. but I fail to see how it concerns me." "The child bears your name," James said, "and your blood. Many children bear many names." Broader opened a drawer, removed a leather pouch. $500 for your trouble and discretion. Such matters only stir hate between good people." The coins clinked as he set the pouch on the desk. The sound struck James like a slap. He thought of Taya dying in the snow, of her gentle plea, of little Eli's trusting grip on his finger. "No." James's voice was quiet but firm. "The boy has rights. His mother had no rights here." Broader's tone hardened. "Nor does any child of questionable breeding. I trust you understand my meaning." Heat rose in James's chest. His hands curled into fists. "Ma'am," he said to Chloe, not taking his eyes from Broader. "Best wait outside." "Both of you will leave," Broader said. "Now, Pike, show them out." The foreman stepped forward, hand again straying to his gun. Chloe touched James's arm. "Please," she murmured, "for Eli's sake." The ride back to Taos passed in taut silence. The sun beat down mercilessly, and dust coated their clothes. Little Eli fussed until Chloe fed him, her movements gentle despite the anger James could see in her rigid spine. "Pike's dangerous," she said finally, as the mission's white cross came into view. "He ran off 2 Mexican families last spring, said they were squatting, but they had proper papers. No one did anything. They were afraid. He has men who follow him, who share his beliefs." James nodded grimly. He'd seen Pike's type before, during the war and after. Men who needed someone to hate, who wrapped cruelty in false righteousness, the kind who'd shoot a man in the back and call it justice. That evening, after settling the mules and helping Chloe put little Eli to bed, James sat at the mission's small writing desk. Lamplight pooled around him as he carefully penned a letter to the territorial court clerk, recording the location of Taya's grave and the date of her death. His handwriting was rough but clear as he detailed the circumstances of finding her, the witness of her last words, the distinctive birthmark on her child's shoulder. He sealed the letter and set it aside for morning posting. Outside, coyotes began their nightly chorus, their wild voices echoing off the adobe walls. James moved to the infirmary, where little Eli lay in his crib, one small hand extended. As if sensing James's presence, the baby opened his eyes. His tiny fingers wrapped around James's weathered one, holding on with surprising strength. James stood there, remembering another small hand, another trusting grip, years and miles away in a war-torn field near Vicksburg. "Sleep well, little one," he whispered. "Sleep well." The coyotes sang their ancient songs to the stars, and somewhere in the darkness, yesterday's tracks slowly filled with wind-blown dust, as if they'd never been made at all. The next 2 days settled into an uneasy rhythm at the mission. James helped with repairs, fixing loose shutters, patching the adobe walls where winter had eaten away at them, while Chloe tended to little Eli and the other children. But beneath this quiet routine, tension simmered like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Whispers traveled through Taos's dusty streets, carried from the general store to the saloon, from the blacksmith's to the trading post. "That Confederate freighter," people muttered, "stole some Indian baby from its dead mama." Each retelling twisted the truth a little more, until James's mercy became theft, his compassion turned to kidnapping. Sunday morning dawned clear and cool. Bells rang from the small wooden church, calling the faithful to worship. James sat in the back pew, hat in his hands, aware of the sideways glances and whispered conversations. Little Eli dozed in Chloe's arms 3 rows ahead, peaceful despite the mounting tension around him. Reverend Samuel Judson stood at the pulpit, his worn Bible open before him. His sermon spoke of Moses in the bulrushes, of providence working through unlikely vessels. His eyes met James's several times, measuring, considering. Then Mrs. Peterson, the banker's wife, rose from her seat. "Begging your pardon, Reverend," she announced in a voice meant to carry, "but how can we worship proper with a stolen child in our midst?" A murmur rippled through the congregation. James's hands tightened on his hat brim, but before he could speak, Chloe stood. She turned to face the assembly, little Eli secure against her shoulder. "This child was not stolen," she said clearly. "He was saved from death by a man who chose mercy over indifference. I've known James Kearney since we were young, and though the war changed many things, it never changed his honest heart." "The boy's mother was Navajo," someone called out. "She was a child of God," Chloe replied firmly. "As is her son, as are we all." Reverend Judson raised his hands for quiet. "Let us remember that judgment belongs to the Lord alone. Mrs. Dunn speaks truth about mercy. Now, shall we continue our worship?" The service resumed, but James noticed how the Reverend's thoughtful gaze returned to him repeatedly. After the final hymn, as the congregation filed out, Judson approached him. "Mr. Kearney, might I have a word?" They walked to the Reverend's small study behind the church. Dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through its single window. Judson closed the door and turned to James. "I need to hear the truth of this matter," he said simply. James told him everything, finding Taya in the storm, her dying wish, the birthmark that marked little Eli as Broder's son, and the rancher's cold denial. Judson listened without interruption, his weathered face grave. When James finished, the Reverend went to his desk and withdrew a folded document. "The Army courier brought this yesterday," he said. "I believe it concerns your situation." James unfolded the paper carefully. The document was a tribal deed, its edges worn, but text still clear. At the bottom, 2 signatures stood side by side, one in careful English letters spelling Taya Begay Broder, the other in flowing Navajo symbols. "It's a transfer of grazing rights," Judson explained, "from her family's traditional lands to her son. The Army clerk who recorded it noted her marriage to Broder. It's all legal and proper." James studied the document, his throat tight. Here was Taya's last gift to her son, proof of his heritage and birthright. The deed described boundaries using both settlers' markers and Navajo references to landmarks: Lightning Split Mesa, Eagle's Shadow Creek, Three Sisters Peaks. "I need to check something," he said. Judson nodded. "Take it. I've made a copy for the church records." James walked quickly to the general store, which kept survey maps tacked to its back wall. As he traced the boundaries described in Taya's deed, his heart began to pound. The grazing claim overlapped nearly half of what was now the Circle B Ranch, the richest valley pastures and the most reliable water sources. He found Chloe at the mission, helping Sister Clara prepare the evening meal. Little Eli played on a blanket nearby, reaching for dust motes in the fading light. James showed them the deed, explaining what he'd discovered. "So that's why she ran," Chloe said softly. "She was protecting her son's inheritance. But James—" She touched his arm. "Broder won't accept this easily. He has influence, money, and— Pike." "The law is the law," James replied. "Even here. That boy has rights, and I aim to see them respected." "Then we must be wise as serpents and gentle as doves," she said. "Let me help. I know some of the territorial judges from my teaching days, and Reverend Judson has influence too. People respect him, even those who don't attend church." They talked late into the night, planning their next move. Sister Clara brought them coffee and fresh bread, listening and offering quiet suggestions. Little Eli slept in his crib nearby, innocent of the storm gathering around him. As the mission's clock struck midnight, they had their strategy. They would confront Broder again, but this time armed with the deed and witnesses, Reverend Judson and Mr. Martinez from the trading post, who remembered Taya's marriage. They would offer a fair compromise, joint guardianship of little Eli, shared access to the grazing lands, a chance to heal old wounds. "We go at dawn," James said, "before Pike can gather his men or Broder can send for his lawyers." Chloe reached for his hand across the table. "With truth and faith," she said softly. "With truth and faith," he echoed. Outside, the wind whispered through the cottonwoods, and somewhere in the darkness, a lone coyote called, a wild, plaintive sound that seemed to carry all the grief and hope of the territory in its voice. Inside the mission's walls, little Eli slept on, while those who had become his protectors prepared to defend not just his inheritance, but the very principle of justice in a land where such things often came second to power and prejudice. James stepped onto the mission's porch, breathing in the cool night air. The stars blazed overhead, ancient and unchanging, the same stars that had witnessed Taya's final journey, that had guided James through war and wilderness, that now watched over her son's uncertain future. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but for now, in this quiet moment, he felt the rightness of their cause settle in his heart like a prayer. The deed rested in his shirt pocket, its edges soft with age, but its truth sharp as a blade. Come morning, that truth would challenge the foundations of power in Taos. Whether it would bring justice or more strife remained to be seen, but James knew they had no choice but to try. For little Eli's sake, and for the sake of all children born between two worlds, they had to believe that truth and faith could still move mountains, or at least the hearts of men who owned them. Sister Clara's voice drifted from the kitchen, singing an old hymn as she kneaded tomorrow's bread. The familiar melody carried memories of simpler times, of church socials and harvest celebrations, of a world before war drew its bitter lines across the land. James closed his eyes, letting the peace of the moment wash over him, gathering strength for the confrontation to come. In a few hours, they would ride north again, toward whatever fate awaited them at the Circle B ranch. But for now, little Eli slept safely. Chloe's quiet strength sustained them, and Providence had given them the means to seek justice. It would have to be enough. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Circle B ranch as James guided his wagon up the rutted drive. Reverend Judson and Chloe followed on horseback, the deed secure in James's coat pocket. His hopes for a peaceful resolution dimmed when he spotted Harlan Pike and two ranch hands blocking the path to the main house. Pike stood with his thumbs hooked in his gun belt, a cruel smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The ranch hands flanked him, rifles held casually but ready. Their horses stamped nervously in the morning chill. "That's far enough, Kearney," Pike called out. "Mr. Broder ain't receiving visitors today." James drew the wagon to a halt, keeping his voice level. "We have business with him. Legal business. Only business you got is leaving town while you still can." Pike spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Ain't that right, boys?" The ranch hands nodded, shifting their rifles slightly. Reverend Judson urged his horse forward. "Mr. Pike, we come in peace, seeking only justice and—" "Save your preaching for Sunday, Reverend," Pike cut in. "This here's private property." The creak of hinges drew their attention to the main house. Elias Broder emerged onto his porch, his broad frame filling the doorway. He surveyed the scene with cold eyes before descending the steps. "I told you yesterday, Kearney. There's nothing to discuss." Broder's voice carried the weight of someone used to being obeyed. "Whatever paper you think gives you rights here means nothing without a white witness to back it." James pulled the deed from his pocket. This document bears the army clerk's seal. It's legal and binding. Broder's laugh held no humor. Legal? Out here? This is cattle country, not some fancy courthouse. Now get off my land before things turn ugly. The boy has a birthright, Chloe spoke up. You can't deny your own son forever. Something flickered in Broder's eyes. Pain, perhaps, or shame, before hardening again. I deny nothing because there is nothing to deny. Pike, see them out. The foreman grinned, hand dropping to his holster. With pleasure, Mr. Broder. James measured the distance between them, knowing he couldn't reach his rifle in time if Pike drew. But before tension could spark into violence, Reverend Judson's calm voice cut through. We'll leave, Mr. Broder. But this matter isn't finished. The Lord sees all truths, even those we try to bury. They turned their mounts and wagons slowly, maintaining dignity in retreat. As they reached the gate, Pike's voice carried after them. Best keep riding clear to Texas, Kearney. Taos ain't big enough for troublemakers. The ride back to town passed in grim silence. At the mission, Sister Clara met them with worried eyes. There's something you need to see, she said softly. A piece of paper had been nailed to the mission's wooden door. James pulled it free, reading the crude scrawl, Bury the half-breed or we'll do it for you. Chloe's face paled, but her voice remained steady. We can't let them frighten us. No, James agreed, but we need to be ready. He turned to Reverend Judson. Can you send word to the territorial marshal? He's 2 days' ride away, but yes, I'll dispatch a messenger immediately. As afternoon faded into evening, James helped Sister Clara board up the mission's ground floor windows. Chloe moved little Eli's crib into the chapel proper, away from outer walls. The boy watched them with solemn dark eyes, as if sensing the tension in the air. Night fell like a heavy blanket over Taos. James positioned himself by the chapel window, rifle across his knees. Moonlight silvered the mission grounds, creating shadows that could hide men or merely stir with the wind. In the quiet, he heard Chloe's soft footsteps approaching. She knelt at the altar, lighting a single candle. Its flame reflected in her eyes as she bowed her head in prayer. James watched her, remembering other nights years ago when they'd shared dreams of a future together before war tore everything apart. Lord, she whispered, grant us wisdom to know your will and courage to do it. Protect this child and guide us toward peace. The night deepened. James caught movements at the edge of his vision, riders passing slowly along the mission's fence line, studying its weaknesses. He counted 3 shapes in the darkness, then 4. They made no move to attack, content for now with intimidation. Before first light, James began loading his wagon quietly in the mission's courtyard. He packed food, blankets, extra ammunition. Chloe appeared with little Eli bundled against the dawn chill. Where will you take him? She asked. Better you don't know yet. I've got a place in mind, safe, out of their reach. He secured the last crate. I'll send word when I can. Chloe touched his arm. Be careful, James. Pike isn't just cruel. He enjoys it. I know his kind. Met too many during the war. He checked his pistol, making sure it rode easy in its holster. Keep the mission doors barred until the marshal arrives. Reverend Judson will look in on you. Sister Clara brought them hot coffee and fresh bread for the journey. As she held little Eli one last time, tears gleamed in her eyes. May the saints watch over you both, she whispered. James lifted little Eli into the wagon, securing him in a nest of blankets. The boy reached for his finger, gripping it tight, and James felt that familiar surge of protectiveness. Whatever came next, he would keep this child safe. The eastern sky was just beginning to pale when James climbed onto the wagon seat. Chloe stood in the mission doorway, her face etched with worry and something deeper. Trust, perhaps, or love reawakening after long winter. "We'll be back," James promised, "whatever it takes to make things right." She nodded, unable to speak. As James urged the mules forward, he heard the mission's heavy door close and the bar drop into place. The wagon rolled quietly through Taos's empty streets, morning mist curling around its wheels like the ghost of possibilities yet to come. In the back, little Eli slept peacefully, one tiny hand still curved as if holding James's finger. The deed rode in James's pocket, its truth waiting to be heard. Somewhere ahead lay safety, and after that, justice. But for now, there was only the road, the lightening sky, and a trust that had to be kept. The wagon disappeared into the morning fog, leaving behind a town balanced on the knife edge of change. In the mission chapel, Chloe's candle still burned, a single point of light in the gathering dawn, as constant as faith and as fragile as hope. Dawn painted the eastern sky in streaks of pale rose and gold as James guided the wagon through Taos's back streets. Chloe sat beside him, little Eli bundled securely in her arms. The morning air bit sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine from the mountains that rose before them like ancient guardians. "We'll take the old trapper's trail," James said quietly, his breath visible in the cold. "It's steeper, but less likely to be watched." Chloe nodded, drawing the blanket tighter around the baby. "Will they follow right away?" "Pike's men won't start looking until they realize we've gone. That gives us a few hours head start." The wagon creaked as they left the last houses behind. James had loaded it carefully. Food, ammunition, medical supplies, and warm clothing. Everything they might need for several days of hiding. The two mules pulled steadily, their hooves crunching through patches of leftover snow. As they began to climb, the sun rose fully above the horizon. Little Eli stirred in his blankets, making soft, cooing sounds. Chloe smiled down at him, touching his cheek gently. "He seems to like the motion of the wagon." "Good thing," James replied. "We've got a long way to go." The old trapper's trail wound up through stands of ponderosa pine, following a narrow creek that tumbled down from the heights. By mid-morning, they'd gained enough elevation to look back over the valley. Taos lay spread out below like a child's toys scattered on a brown blanket, the mission's white cross still visible in the distance. The wagon's progress slowed as the trail grew steeper. James walked beside it often, guiding the mules around sharp turns and rough patches. Chloe took her turn walking too, carrying little Eli in a sling across her chest. The exercise kept them warm as the temperature dropped with elevation. Around noon, the weather began to turn. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, bringing with them a bitter wind that cut through their coats. The first drops of sleet stung their faces. "There's an old cabin up ahead," James said, his voice nearly lost in the rising wind. "Used to belong to a French trapper named Baptiste, if it's still standing. We can wait out the storm there." The sleet fell harder as they pushed on. Little Eli began to fuss, disturbed by the cold and the wagon's increasingly rough motion. Chloe hummed softly to him, an old hymn that seemed to calm his protests. It was mid-afternoon when they finally spotted the cabin. Built against a rocky outcrop beside the creek, its log walls had weathered to a deep gray. The roof sagged but looked solid enough to keep out the weather. James helped Chloe down from the wagon, then quickly led the mules into the lean-to shelter attached to the cabin's side. While he unharnessed them, Chloe pushed open the cabin's heavy door. The interior was musty but dry, with a stone fireplace and rough-hewn furniture still in place. "It's better than I hoped," she said, brushing cobwebs from a chair. "The chimney looks clear too." They worked quickly to bring in supplies and make the space livable. James found dry wood stacked along one wall and soon had a fire crackling in the hearth. Chloe set up a makeshift bed for little Eli using blankets and their spare coats, placing it close enough to the fire for warmth, but not danger. Outside, the sleet turned to steady snow. The creek's song provided a constant backdrop to their movements as they settled in for the night. James checked his weapons and set them within easy reach, then helped Chloe prepare a simple meal of beans and dried beef. Little Eli watched them from his nest of blankets, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. When Chloe offered him warm goat's milk from their supplies, he drank eagerly. His small hands reached for the dancing shadows on the cabin walls. As night drew in, the wind rose to a hollow moan around the cabin's corners. James added more wood to the fire, its light creating a circle of warmth in the growing darkness. Chloe sat close to the hearth, little Eli dozing in her lap. "I still wear it, you know," she said softly, breaking their comfortable silence. Her fingers touched the silver cross that hung from a thin chain around her neck. "All these years, I never took it off." James remembered the day he'd given it to her, just before leaving for the war. They'd been so young, so certain of their future together. "I thought about you every time I saw a sunset," he admitted. "Wondered if you were watching it too. I was angry for so long when you didn't come back after Vicksburg." Her voice held old pain, but no bitterness now. "I thought you'd chosen to stay away. I couldn't face anyone after what happened there. After losing John." His son's name still caught in his throat. "The things I did during the war. I've got sins that weigh heavy, Chloe." She reached across and touched his hand. "We all carry burdens, James. But look at what Providence has brought us. This child who needs us. This chance to make something right." Little Eli stirred then, letting out a bright laugh as a spark from the fire spiraled up the chimney. The sound seemed to fill the cabin, with unexpected joy melting away years of hurt and regret. "Maybe that's why we're here," James said quietly, "not just to protect him, but to learn from him. Children don't carry yesterday's shadows." Chloe smiled, and in the firelight he saw tears in her eyes. "You've changed, James Kearney. There's a softness in you now that wasn't there before. Had to learn it the hard way." He moved closer, drawn by memories and new hope alike. "But I reckon some things don't change at all." Their shared look held volumes of unspoken words. Little Eli chose that moment to reach up and pat Chloe's cheek, making them both laugh. The cabin felt suddenly full of possibility, despite the danger that had driven them here. The night deepened. James took first watch while Chloe slept with little Eli secure beside her. The fire's warmth and the creek's steady voice made it easy to imagine they were safe. But James knew better. Pike would not give up easily. His vigilance proved necessary. Shortly after noon the next day, James spotted movement in the valley below. 4 riders moved slowly along the creek, checking the trail. Even at this distance, he recognized Pike's lean figure leading them. "They're quartering the valley," he told Chloe, who stood at his shoulder. "Looking for signs of where we turned off." They retreated inside the cabin, keeping little Eli quiet, and the fire banked low to prevent smoke from drawing attention. Hours crept by as they watched through cracks between the logs. The riders searched methodically, but the fresh snow had covered their tracks. As evening approached, Pike's group finally moved off towards the west, probably to check other trails. James and Chloe shared a look of relief, but they knew this was only a temporary reprieve. "We'll wait until full dark," James said. Then decide our next move." Chloe nodded, holding little Eli close. "We can't keep running forever." "No," James agreed. "But we can run long enough to find justice. That's all this little one needs, a chance at his rightful place in the world." Outside, shadows lengthened across the snow as the sun set behind the mountains. Inside the cabin, they waited in hopeful silence, 3 hearts beating as one in the gathering dark. The fire's last embers glowed like tiny stars, promising warmth would return with the dawn. 3 days passed in the mountain cabin, like a dream removed from time. James kept watch while Chloe tended to little Eli, their routine falling into comfortable patterns despite the constant tension. The creek's song mixed with the baby's occasional laughter, creating moments of peace that made their situation seem almost normal. On the morning of the 4th day, James heard hoofbeats approaching from the south. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, gesturing for Chloe to take little Eli to the back room. Through the frosted glass, he made out 2 riders making their way carefully up the snowy trail. "Wait," he said, lowering his weapon. "It's Reverend Judson, and that's Miguel from the mission stable with him." Chloe came to look, little Eli balanced on her hip. "How did they find us?" "Miguel's the best tracker in Taos," James said. "Must have followed our trail before the snow covered it." They stepped outside to meet the riders. Reverend Judson dismounted with the stiffness of a man who'd spent too many hours in the saddle. His usually neat black coat was travel-stained, but his eyes were bright with purpose. "Brother James, Sister Chloe," he said, stamping his boots to warm his feet. "The Lord be praised for leading us to you safely." Miguel, a wiry boy of 14, grinned from atop his pony. "Wasn't hard to follow once I found where you crossed the creek, Senor. The wagon left good marks before the snow." Inside the cabin, they shared what remained of their coffee while Judson explained his mission. The Reverend's normally gentle voice carried an edge of urgency. "You must return to Taos," he said, warming his hands around the tin cup. "Running only makes you look guilty in the eyes of those who want to believe the worst." "Pike's men are watching the trails," James objected. "It's not safe." Judson nodded. "I understand your fear, brother, but I've spoken with the territorial judge in Santa Fe by telegraph. He's reviewing the deed and will send deputies if needed. What we need now is to establish the child's legal identity in public record." Chloe looked up from where she sat, feeding little Eli. "How do we do that?" "Through baptism," Judson said. "This Sunday before the whole congregation. No one can deny a child's right to God's grace, and once his name is recorded in the church register, his existence becomes official fact." James paced the small cabin, boots heavy on the wooden floor. "You're asking us to walk right into their hands. Brother won't stand idle while we claim his son in public." "That's exactly what I'm counting on," Judson replied. "If he objects, he must do so before witnesses. If he stays silent, his acceptance is assumed by law. Either way, the truth comes to light." Chloe touched the silver cross at her neck, a gesture James had come to recognize as her way of finding strength. "I trust Reverend Judson's wisdom in this, James. We can't hide forever." The fire popped and sparked as James considered their options. Little Eli watched him with those dark, knowing eyes that seemed to hold centuries of his people's wisdom. "When?" James finally asked. "We'll leave at first light tomorrow," Judson said. "I've arranged for several deacons to ride with us for protection. Miguel will guide us back by the old Spanish trail. It's longer but less exposed." That evening, they prepared for the journey home. James checked the wagon while Chloe packed their few supplies. Miguel helped tend the mules, chattering about happenings in town during their absence. Judson sat by the fire writing in his small notebook, occasionally murmuring prayers under his breath. Next morning dawned clear and cold. 4 deacons from the mission waited where the trail met the main road, their presence both comforting and a reminder of the danger they faced. The small convoy moved slowly through the mountain passes, everyone alert for signs of pursuit. They reached Taos as the sun was setting, the mission's white cross catching the last golden light. Sister Clara met them at the gate, tears in her eyes as she embraced Chloe and the baby. Other children from the orphanage crowded around, eager to welcome them back. After the evening meal, Judson asked James and Chloe to join him in the mission's small study. Maps and papers covered his desk, and a telegram from Santa Fe lay open beside an inkwell. "The territorial court is very interested in this case," he said, lighting the lamp. "The deed appears genuine, and there are witnesses to Taya's marriage to Broder. But we need to move carefully. The law still favors white men's claims over Indian rights." "What about the baptism?" Chloe asked. She had settled little Eli in a basket beside her chair, where he played contentedly with a wooden cross. "Sunday morning, during regular service, the whole town will be there." Judson picked up his Bible, wrapped in worn oilcloth. "I've already announced it from the pulpit. Broder can't ignore it without losing face with his business partners." James leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "He might do worse than ignore it. That's why we'll have the sheriff present. As a witness only, mind you, but his presence should prevent violence." Judson smiled slightly. "Sometimes the Lord works through official channels." They discussed details late into the night. Judson had thought of everything: the precise wording of the baptismal record, the positioning of trusted men in the congregation, even which hymns would best remind people of Christian charity. Later, in the mission's kitchen, Chloe prepared little Eli for bed, while James helped Sister Clara clean up after supper. The familiar space felt both welcoming and strange after their days in the wilderness. Through the window, heat lightning flickered in the distance, promising storms to come. Chloe began to hum as she worked, an old hymn that James recognized from their courting days. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." Her voice was soft but sure, and little Eli watched her with heavy-lidded eyes as sleep crept over him. The gentle domestic scene struck James with unexpected force. This was what he'd been fighting for without fully realizing it. Not just justice or redemption, but the chance to build something whole and good from the broken pieces of their past. Thunder rolled across the valley, still far off, but growing closer. Sister Clara crossed herself and muttered a prayer in Spanish. In his basket, little Eli finally drifted off to sleep, one small hand curled around the wooden cross. "The storm's coming whether we're ready or not," James said, quietly. Chloe looked up from the sleeping child. "We're ready, James. We have to be. This little one deserves his place in the world, and God has given us the strength to help him claim it." Judson appeared in the doorway, his face grave but peaceful. "I've sent copies of the deed to Santa Fe by evening stage. The telegraph operator promises word from the territorial judge by Saturday." He smiled at little Eli. "Sleep well, little one. Sunday will be a big day for you." They all knew the baptism would force Broder's hand, one way or another. The thought hung heavy in the air as they prepared for bed, each lost in private prayers and preparations for what lay ahead. Outside, the thunder grew louder, nature's own drums beating out a warning of battles yet to come. But inside the mission's solid walls, peace held sway for now. Little Eli slept safely in his crib, watched over by those who had chosen love over fear, faith over convenience, and truth over comfortable lies. James took first watch that night, his rifle across his knees as he sat by the window. The storm drew closer, lightning illuminating the courtyard in brief, brilliant flashes. Each burst revealed empty shadows. But he knew the real threat wasn't from the weather. Sunday's baptism would change everything, for better or worse. As another peal of thunder shook the mission's adobe walls, James found himself hoping that Judson's faith in law and Christian charity would prove stronger than Broder's pride and Pike's malice. In the next room, he could hear Chloe humming that hymn again, soft and low, a reminder that grace could still be found even in the darkest hours. The sound carried him through his vigil as the storm raged outside, its fury spending itself against the mission's ancient walls, while those within waited for dawn and whatever it might bring. Sunday morning arrived under steel-gray skies. Thunder rolled across the Sangre de Cristo mountains, shaking windows and rattling the church's wooden cross. Inside the small, whitewashed sanctuary, oil lamps cast flickering shadows as townspeople filed in, their Sunday best dampened by the journey through the rain. James stood at the back of the church, little Eli bundled against his chest. The baby was quiet, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Chloe arranged fresh flowers near the brass baptismal basin, her hands steady despite her nerves. She had dressed little Eli in a white gown she'd sewn herself, trimmed with carefully preserved lace from her own christening dress. "Quite a crowd," Reverend Judson murmured, joining James by the door. Word spread fast. Indeed, the wooden pews filled quickly. Ranchers sat beside shopkeepers, farm wives next to wealthy merchants' ladies. Children fidgeted in their starched collars, while parents whispered behind prayer books. The air felt thick with anticipation. Sister Clara led the orphanage children to their usual spots in the front pews. They turned often to smile at little Eli, who had become their favorite during his brief stay at the mission. Miguel, the stable boy, stood guard near the side door, trying to look grown up in his borrowed suit coat. A hush fell over the congregation as heavy bootsteps sounded on the church porch. Elias Broder entered, removing his wet hat. His gray-streaked beard was neatly trimmed, his black suit immaculate despite the weather. Harlan Pike followed close behind, his lean face set in barely concealed contempt. They took seats near the back, Pike's gun belt clearly visible beneath his coat. James felt little Eli stir against him as lightning flashed outside, followed by a crack of thunder that made the windows rattle. The baby didn't cry, though. He simply turned his dark eyes toward the sound, showing the same quiet strength his mother had possessed. Reverend Judson moved to the pulpit as the church bell tolled 9 times, its deep notes mixed with the drumming rain on the roof. The service began with a familiar hymn, "Come, thou fount of every blessing." The congregation's voices rose uncertain at first, then stronger, filling the small space with hope. James watched Broder during the singing. The rancher's face remained stone still, but his hands gripped the pew in front of him until his knuckles showed white. Pike kept his cold gaze fixed on James and the baby, one hand never far from his gun. After the opening prayers, Reverend Judson spoke in his clear, carrying voice. "Brothers and sisters, we gather today not only for regular worship, but for the sacred rite of baptism. A child has been brought to receive God's grace and to be welcomed into our community of faith." A murmur rippled through the church. Chloe stepped forward to take little Eli, but James shook his head slightly. This was his responsibility. He walked slowly down the center aisle, feeling every eye upon them. The baby's warmth against his chest gave him courage. "Who presents this child for baptism?" Judson asked, following the familiar liturgy. James's voice came steady and strong. "I do." "And what name is given to this child?" This was the moment of truth. James turned to face Broder, speaking clearly above the rain. "That right belongs to his father. Elias Broder, will you name your son?" The silence that followed felt endless. Lightning flickered through the stained glass windows, painting sacred shadows across the wooden floor. Broder remained seated, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "Mr. Broder?" Reverend Judson prompted gently. "This child bears your blood. Will you acknowledge him before God and this congregation?" Pike shifted in his seat, hand moving toward his gun. But Broder didn't move. James stepped closer to the baptismal basin, his decision made. "If you won't name your son, I will. This child deserves—" "Wait." The word came so softly at first that few heard it. Then Broder stood, his large frame trembling slightly. "Wait," he said again, louder this time. The congregation held its collective breath as Broder walked forward. Up close, James could see the tears threatening in the rancher's eyes. For a long moment, Broder simply stared at the baby, who looked back at him without fear. "I see her in his eyes," Broder whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Taya, my wife!" Another crack of thunder shook the church. Little Eli reached out one tiny hand toward Broder's beard. The simple gesture seemed to break something loose in the rancher's heart. "Ashki Yazi," Broder said, touching his son's cheek with trembling fingers. "It means little boy. It's what she wanted to call him. She told me, before I let my pride drive her away." The words fell into the hushed church like stones into still water. Several women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Even the children sat silent, sensing the weight of the moment. "She was my wife," Broder continued, his voice growing stronger. "Married proper in Santa Fe before witnesses. I have the papers still, locked away with her picture. I thought I could protect my reputation by denying her, denying our child. But I was wrong. Dear God, I was wrong." Reverend Judson stepped forward, his Bible open in his hands. "Then you acknowledge this child as your son, Elias Broder?" "I do," Broder's voice cracked. "I acknowledge him before God and man. His name is Elias Ashki Yazi Broder, son of Taya Begai Broder, my lawful wife." A flash of lightning illuminated the church as James carefully placed little Eli into his father's arms. The baby reached up to pat Broder's wet cheeks, bringing a smile to the rancher's face. The first genuine smile James had seen from him. The sacred moment stretched out, filled with possibility. James felt Chloe's hand slip into his as they watched father and son together. Perhaps, he thought, redemption was possible after all. Perhaps the wounds of the past could heal. Then came the sound of a bench scraping harshly against the floor. Harlan Pike stood, his face twisted with disgust. Without a word, he stormed down the aisle and out of the church, letting the heavy door slam behind him. The sound echoed like a gunshot through the sanctuary, making several people jump. But Broder didn't seem to notice his foreman's departure. He stood straight and proud now, holding his son close as Reverend Judson began the baptismal prayers. Together they moved to the brass basin filled with blessed water. "Elias Ashki Yaji Broder," Judson intoned solemnly, "I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." As the water touched the baby's forehead, another peal of thunder rolled across the valley. But this time, little Eli laughed, a bright, clear sound that seemed to chase away the storm's shadows. The congregation smiled, then laughed with him, the tension of the morning breaking at last. James watched as Broder cradled his son, whispering soft words in mixed English and Navajo. The rancher's tears fell freely now, but they were tears of joy and regret mingled together, the kind that could wash a soul clean. Sister Clara began playing the organ, and the congregation joined in singing Amazing Grace. The familiar words filled the church as the rain continued to fall outside, but its sound had softened from threatening to cleansing. Through the windows, patches of blue sky began to show between the clouds. Chloe squeezed James's hand, and he looked down to see her own eyes shining with happy tears. They both knew their fight wasn't over. Pike's dramatic exit had made that clear enough. But for this moment, in this sacred space, love had won a victory over fear, and truth had triumphed over lies. Little Eli, now officially named and blessed, continued to laugh in his father's arms as the hymn rose around them. The baby's joy seemed to touch everyone present, as if God's grace had become visible in the smile of a child who bridged two worlds. The peace of the baptismal morning shattered like glass in the dark hours before dawn. James had dozed off in his wagon, parked close to the mission's gate where he could keep watch. The spring night air carried a bite, but he'd known worse discomfort during the war. His rifle lay within easy reach, though he prayed he wouldn't need it. A horse's soft nicker pulled him from half-sleep. Then came the sharp crack of a match striking, and the world erupted in orange light. Flames leaped up the side of his wagon, consuming the canvas cover with horrifying speed. The smell of coal oil filled his lungs. They doused the wagon while he slept. James lunged for his rifle, but thick smoke blinded him. He heard his mules screaming in terror, their hooves thundering against the wooden gate as they tried to break free. "Fire!" the shout came from the mission house. "Fire at the gate!" James stumbled from the burning wagon, coughing violently. His eyes streamed as he tried to make out shapes in the darkness. Horses' hooves pounded the earth. Somewhere, a baby wailed. The sound cut through his confusion like a knife. "Little Eli!" He staggered towards the mission door, just as Chloe burst out, her nightdress billowing. "James, the nursery, they took him." Reverend Judson appeared behind her, pulling on his coat. "I saw riders heading east." James caught a glimpse of mounted figures disappearing into the pre-dawn gloom. Pike's unmistakable lean figure led them, and in his arms, a small bundle wrapped in a blanket. "No!" The cry tore from James's throat as he ran towards the mission's stable. But his legs betrayed him, weakened by smoke. He fell to his knees, chest heaving with desperate coughs. The mission's bell began to toll, rung by Sister Clara to alert the town. Other doors opened along the street as neighbors emerged. The flames from James's wagon painted everything in hellish light. "The mules!" Chloe cried. "They'll burn!" James forced himself up, stumbling to where his team thrashed in their traces. With shaking hands, he cut them loose. The frightened animals bolted into the night, taking with them his livelihood, the heavy freight wagon, tools and supplies that had sustained him since the war. But none of that mattered now. Only the child mattered. "We have to follow them," he gasped, still fighting for breath. "Pike's taken him east, toward the line shacks, maybe." "James." Reverend Judson's hand gripped his shoulder. "Look." Through the smoke and gathering crowd, James saw men approaching on horseback. The sheriff's badge glinted in the firelight. "James Kearney," Sheriff Morton's voice carried clear and cold. "You're under arrest for fraud and inciting unrest in this territory." "What?" Chloe stepped forward. "This is madness. They've just stolen a child. Ma'am, step back." The sheriff's deputy moved his horse between her and James. "We've had complaints about forged documents being used to steal land, and now this fire." "I didn't start this fire." James's voice was raw from smoke. "Pike took the boy, Broder's son. You have to—" "Enough." The sheriff dismounted. "The boy's welfare ain't your concern no more. You're going to jail until we sort this mess out." James looked desperately at Reverend Judson, who nodded slightly. "Go peacefully, James. We'll find him. I swear it." The steel of handcuffs bit into James's wrists. He could barely stand, still choking on smoke, as they led him away. Behind him, he heard Chloe's quiet sobs mixing with the crackling flames and the mission bell's mournful toll. Dawn found him in a cell, staring through iron bars at gray stone walls. His throat felt scraped raw, and his eyes still burned from the smoke. But worse was the ache in his heart, knowing little Eli was out there somewhere, probably frightened and crying for familiar faces. The sheriff's office slowly filled with morning light. James heard townspeople coming and going, their voices muffled through the thick adobe walls. None spoke in his defense. To them, he was just a drifter who'd caused trouble, upset the natural order of things. Around mid-morning, Chloe appeared at his cell. Her face was pale with exhaustion, but determination burned in her eyes. "The sheriff won't listen," she said quietly. "He claims the deed is suspicious because it's written in both English and Navajo, says no court will recognize it without proper witnesses." James gripped the bars. "What about Broder? Surely now that he's acknowledged his son, no one's seen him since last night." Chloe's voice trembled. "Reverend Judson rode out to the ranch at first light, found Broder passed out drunk in his study. He couldn't, or wouldn't, say anything about Pike's plans." James closed his eyes, fighting back despair. He'd failed them all. Taya, who'd trusted him with her dying breath. Little Eli, who'd brought light back into his dark world. And Chloe, whose faith in him had been renewed too briefly. Through the small window high in his cell, he could see smoke still, rising from the mission gate where his wagon had burned. Everything he owned had been in that wagon: tools, trade goods, even the small wooden cross he'd carved during the war. All gone now, like ashes in the wind. The day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Reverend Judson came in the afternoon, his normally neat appearance disheveled from riding. He spoke to James through the bars in low tones. "I've sent telegrams to Santa Fe," he said. "The territorial court needs to see this case, but it will take time. Days, maybe weeks." "The boy doesn't have weeks," James replied hoarsely. "Pike hates anything that ain't pure white. He couldn't finish the thought. "I know." Judson's face was grave. "But we have to trust in the Lord's protection, and in Broder. Despite everything, that's his son out there." "Broder's a broken man," James said bitterly, "drowning his guilt in whiskey while his foreman does the devil's work." As if summoned by those words, they heard a commotion outside. Through the window, James glimpsed Elias Broder stumbling down the street, his fine coat stained and wrinkled. The rancher's face was haggard, his eyes red-rimmed from drinking. "My boy," they heard him mumbling as he passed. "My poor boy. Taya, forgive me." The sight sent a chill through James's heart. If even Broder had lost control of Pike, what hope did they have of finding little Eli in time? Evening settled over the town like a shroud. The jail grew dark, except for one oil lamp burning on the sheriff's desk. James paced his cell, 7 steps each way, trying to keep his mind from imagining what might be happening at Pike's hidden camp. He knew the line shacks, rough cabins scattered through the hills where cowboys stayed while working distant pastures. Pike could have taken the baby to any of them, or worse, somewhere else entirely. The spring nights were still cold in the high country. A baby needed proper care, warm milk, gentle hands. His fists clenched until his nails bit into his palms. This was his punishment, he thought bitterly. For all the lives he'd taken in the war, for the son he couldn't save at Vicksburg, for abandoning his faith when the world turned cruel. Now another innocent child would suffer because of him. "Our Father, who art in heaven." The whispered prayer surprised him. He hadn't spoken those words in years, but now they came unbidden, rising from some deep place in his soul that hadn't completely withered. "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done." Outside his cell window, an owl called mournfully into the gathering night. Somewhere in the darkness, a baby waited to be found. And James Kearney, locked behind iron bars, could do nothing but pray and hope that this time God was listening. The night deepened. No one came to check on him except the deputy bringing a plate of beans and hard bread. James couldn't eat. His throat still burned from the smoke, and worry gnawed at his gut like hunger never could. I too thought of Chloe, probably keeping vigil at the mission with Sister Clara and the other orphans, of Reverend Judson, perhaps still riding the hills, searching for any sign of Pike's men, of Broder, drowning in guilt and whiskey while his son's life hung in the balance. And most of all, he thought of little Eli, remembered the boy's bright laugh during his baptism just hours ago, the way he'd reached for his father's face with such innocent trust. That laughter seemed to belong to another world now, separated from this one by flame and shadow. James sank onto his thin jail cot, every muscle aching from smoke and stress. Through the window, he could see stars appearing one by one in the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, under those same stars, a child needed him. But iron bars and the law's blind justice held him fast, as helpless as he'd been the day his own son died. The night stretched endless before him, each minute an eternity of worry and regret. All he could do was wait and pray that morning's light would bring some hope of salvation, some way to make things right before it was too late. In the distance, a coyote howled, a sound like mourning, like warning, like despair. James closed his eyes but found no rest, his dreams haunted by flames and a baby's cry fading into darkness. The moon cast thin shadows through the jail cell's barred window. James knelt on the cold stone floor, his hands clasped tightly. The words felt strange on his lips after so many years, but they came nonetheless, whispered into the darkness. "Please, bury my child." Taya's final plea echoed in his mind, but now he understood its deeper meaning with sudden clarity. She hadn't been asking him to bury her son in the earth. She'd been begging him to bury the hatred that had driven her into exile, the prejudice that had torn her family apart. His throat tightened as tears finally came, breaking through the wall he'd built around his heart since Vicksburg. He remembered his own son, barely 17, dying in his arms during the siege. He'd buried his faith along with his boy that day, turning away from a God he thought had abandoned him. But now, in this cell, something stirred within him, like a seed breaking through frozen ground after winter's thaw. The simple truth of Taya's wisdom struck him to his core. Life, not death, was the answer. Love, not hatred, would save her child. "Lord," he whispered hoarsely, "I've been running from you since the war, but I ain't running anymore. Help me save this boy. Show me the way." A soft scraping sound made him look up. Reverend Judson stood outside his cell, holding a leather-bound Bible and a folded piece of paper. The preacher glanced cautiously down the hallway before speaking in hushed tones. "The deputies stepped out for coffee," Judson said. "We don't have much time." James rose stiffly, his knees protesting the hard floor. He moved to the bars as Judson pressed the Bible through, along with the, note. The book was worn, its pages soft with use. "Open to Psalms," Judson murmured. "David knew something about persecution and justice?" James nodded, throat too tight for words. His fingers found the folded note tucked between the pages. He recognized Chloe's neat schoolteacher's hand. "Hold fast. The child lives." Relief flooded through him, making his legs weak. He gripped the bars to steady himself. "How do you know?" "We received word from a ranch hand who deserted Pike's group," Judson explained quietly. The boy was alive when they reached the line shacks last night. Pike's keeping him there until... The preacher's voice trailed off. Until what? Judson's face was grim in the shadows. Until he can make him disappear permanently. Pike means to take him far south, perhaps into Mexico. No one would ever find him. James's hands tightened on the iron bars until his knuckles went white. Where's Chloe now? She rode to Broder's ranch an hour ago. Said she had to try reasoning with him one last time. Judson's worry was evident in his voice. I tried to stop her, but... She's got more courage than sense sometimes, James said, but pride and fear mingled in his tone. The thump of boots in the hallway made them both tense. Judson stepped back quickly, adopting his formal preacher's manner just as the deputy rounded the corner. Evening, Reverend, the deputy said, suspicious. Bit late for pastoral calls, ain't it? A shepherd's work knows no hour, Judson replied smoothly. But you're right. I should be going. Good night, Brother James. Remember what David wrote about deliverance. James clutched the Bible to his chest, watching Judson's retreating form. The deputy gave him a hard look before settling back at his desk, boots propped up as he cleaned his revolver. Meanwhile, Chloe guided her horse through gathering darkness toward the Broder ranch. The moon provided just enough light to follow the rutted road. Her heart pounded, but her hands were steady on the reins. She'd taught herself to be brave during the war, when she'd had to run the mission alone. This was no different. Another child needed her protection. The ranch house loomed ahead, its windows dark except for a faint glow from Broder's study. She dismounted, tied her horse, and approached the front door. No one answered her knock, but she heard coughing from within. Mr. Broder, she called, pushing the door open. It's Chloe Dunn from the mission. The study was thick with pipe smoke and the sour smell of whiskey. Broder sat slumped in his leather chair, a half-empty bottle on the desk before him. His face was ashen, and his breathing came in wet, rattling gasps. Come to gloat, he wheezed. The mighty rancher brought low by his sins? Chloe moved closer, her skirts rustling in the silence. I've come about your son. Broder's laugh turned into a coughing fit. When it passed, blood flecked his handkerchief. My son? I denied him. Denied his mother. Denied my own heart, for fear of what others would think. His voice broke. And now Pike's taken him. My boy. Where? Chloe pressed, stepping closer. Where did Pike take him? Broder's bloodshot eyes met hers. Why do you care? You're not his blood. Because every child deserves love, she said firmly. Because your wife trusted James to save him. Because God puts people in our path for a reason, Mr. Broder, and sometimes those people become family by choice rather than birth. Something in her words seemed to reach him. He slumped further in his chair, suddenly looking old and beaten. The old mining cabins, he said quietly, near Red Mesa. Pike thinks they're abandoned, but there's still some Chinese workers living there. He won't expect anyone to look there. Chloe's heart leaped. How far? 3 hours hard ride to the south. Another coughing fit seized him. When it passed, he grabbed her arm with surprising strength. Miss Dunn, tell my boy, tell him his father was a coward who learned too late what matters. Tell him his mother was the bravest soul I ever knew. Tell him yourself, Chloe said gently. When we bring him home. But Broder's eyes were distant now, fixed on something she couldn't see. Taya, he whispered. My love, forgive me. His hand fell away from her arm. His breathing grew more labored. Chloe knew she should stay, offer comfort to a dying man, but every minute mattered now. She said a quick prayer over him and hurried out into the night. The moon had risen higher, painting the landscape in silver and shadow. Chloe mounted her horse and turned south, toward Red Mesa. Her mind raced with plans. She would need help, supplies, a way to get word to James and Judson. But first, she had to reach the mining cabins before Pike moved the baby again. The territory was vast, with countless places to hide a small child. This might be their only chance. She pressed her heels to her horse's flanks, urging more speed. The animal responded willingly, sensing its rider's urgency. Together they flew through the night, hooves thundering against packed earth, kicking up dust that glowed like stardust in the moonlight. Back in his cell, James held Chloe's note close to the window, reading it again in the dim light. "Hold fast. The child lives." 4 simple words that kept hope burning in his heart. He opened the Bible Judson had left, finding comfort in its familiar weight. How long had it been since he'd really read these words, since he'd allowed himself to believe in something greater than his own pain? His fingers found Psalms, as Judson had suggested. The pages fell open to the 23rd Psalm, and James began to read in a whisper, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The ancient words washed over him like cool water, soothing his troubled spirit. He read on, hour after hour, as the moon tracked across the sky. Somewhere out there, Chloe was riding through the night, racing against time to save a child who had brought them all together. James closed his eyes, clutching the Bible to his chest. This time his prayer came easier, rising from a heart that was finally ready to believe again. "Lord, watch over them both. Guide Chloe's path. Keep little Eli safe. And if it be your will, let me make things right." The deputy's snores filled the jail now, but James remained awake, keeping vigil through the long hours until dawn. He had failed Taya's literal request to bury her child, but perhaps in choosing life over death, love over hatred, he had honored the deeper truth of her dying wish. The first pale light of morning began to creep through his window. Another day was beginning, bringing either salvation or heartbreak. All James could do was wait and pray and hold fast to the hope in Chloe's message. In the growing light, he read the note one more time, drawing strength from her steadfast faith. "Hold fast. The child lives." The first rays of sunlight painted the jail's adobe walls in shades of rose and gold. Inside, James paced his cell, 7 steps one way, 7 steps back. The rhythmic sound of his boots on wooden planks matched his racing heartbeat. Something was changing. He could feel it in the air. Voices drifted through the barred window, growing louder. Multiple sets of footsteps approached the jail's entrance. The heavy door creaked open, flooding the dim interior with morning light. "Sheriff ain't here," the deputy protested. "You can't just—" "We can and we will." Reverend Judson's normally gentle voice carried steel. Behind him stood Chloe, and at least a dozen townspeople, merchants, farmers, and even old Diego from the cantina. "This man's done nothing wrong," declared Mrs. Martinez, the baker's wife. "We all saw what happened at the baptism. Broder himself named that child." The deputy's hand hovered near his gun belt. "Now see here." "Son," Judson said quietly, "there are times when the law of man must bow to the law of conscience. This is one of them." Chloe stepped forward, holding out a folded paper. "This just arrived by telegraph from Santa Fe. The territorial court has validated Taya Begay's deed. That child is legally Broder's heir." The deputy's shoulders sagged as he read the document. Without a word, he removed the ring of keys from his belt and unlocked James's cell. James stepped out, blinking in the bright light. His legs felt weak after 2 days confined, but determination steadied him. "Where's my gun belt?" "Here." Diego handed him the worn leather, complete with revolver. "Your wagon burned, but I saved your Winchester too. It's outside with the horses." "Much obliged." James buckled on the gun belt, checking that the single-action revolver was loaded. Every cartridge might count before this day was done. Chloe touched his arm. "Broder's dying," she said softly. "He told me where Pike took little Eli, the old mining cabins near Red Mesa." 3 hours hard ride south, Judson added. "If we leave now, we're burning daylight," James said. He turned to the gathered townspeople. "Thank you all. This means more than I can say." Outside, 3 saddled horses waited. James's heart swelled at the sight of his own bay gelding, somehow saved from the wagon fire. The animal nickered a greeting as James swung into the saddle. They rode hard through the morning, hooves thundering across the high desert. The spring sun climbed higher, burning away the dawn chill. James led them south, following game trails and dry arroyos to save time. But the recent storms had left their mark. What should have been firm ground had turned treacherous with mud. Their horses struggled in the heavy going, forced to pick their way carefully across saturated creek beds and around unstable slopes. By midday, they had covered barely half the distance to Red Mesa. The horses were lathered and breathing hard, requiring frequent rest stops. During one such pause, Judson passed around his canteen. "Pike will have pushed his horse just as hard," Chloe said, trying to sound hopeful. "He can't have gotten much further ahead." James nodded grimly. "Question is, what will he do when he realizes we're coming? Man like that, cornered." "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Judson reminded them. "Have faith." They pressed on through the afternoon heat. The terrain grew rougher as they entered canyon country, red rock walls rising around them. Shadows lengthened across their path. Their horses' steps grew more labored. Finally, as dusk approached, James raised his hand for a halt. Ahead, a thin spiral of smoke rose against the darkening sky. "There," he whispered, pointing to a cluster of old wooden buildings nestled against the canyon wall. "The mining cabins." They dismounted and secured their horses in a sheltered draw. James checked his revolver one final time, testing the action. The familiar click steadied his nerves. "I'll go in first," he said. "Reverend, you circle around back in case Pike tries to run. Chloe, stay with the horses." "No." Chloe's voice was firm. "That's my boy in there. I'm coming with you." James started to argue, then saw the determination in her eyes. He remembered how she'd faced down armed men during the war, protecting her mission children. He nodded slowly. "Stay behind me," he said. "And if shooting starts—" "I remember how to duck," she finished with a faint smile. They moved forward through deepening shadows, using rock outcroppings for cover. The smoke grew stronger. Someone had recently fed the fire. As they drew closer, James could make out a single cabin with light showing through its grimy window. 20 yards from the cabin, a twig snapped under someone's boot. James whirled, revolver raised. Pike stood in the gathering dark, his own gun already drawn. "Should have known you'd come," he sneered. "Always was too stubborn to know when you're beat." "It's over, Pike," James said evenly. "The territorial courts ruled. That boy belongs with his father." "That half-breed bastard," Pike spat. "Broder's gone soft, but I ain't. Some bloodlines need to stay pure." "The only thing pure about you is hatred," Chloe said from behind James. "Let us take him home." Pike's gun shifted slightly toward her voice. It was all the opening James needed. He lunged forward, knocking Pike's arm aside as the gun went off. The report echoed off canyon walls like thunder. They grappled in the dust, neither able to bring their weapon to bear. Pike was younger, stronger, but James had the desperation of a man fighting for something larger than himself. They rolled, kicked, traded blows that would leave bruises for weeks. A second shot split the night. Pike's gun, discharged in the struggle. The bullet struck rock, ricocheting with a deadly whine. Pike suddenly went rigid. His eyes widened in shock as red spread across his shirt front. "No," he gasped. "Not like this." He stumbled backward, gun falling from nerveless fingers. Another step and he was gone, vanishing into the darkness beyond the firelight. They heard his faltering footsteps, then silence. James retrieved both fallen revolvers, then turned toward the cabin. "Chloe?" "Here." She emerged from behind a boulder, unharmed. "The baby." They burst through the cabin door together. The single room was mostly empty, except for a rough cot in one corner. There, wrapped in familiar blankets, lay little Eli. Chloe scooped him up, checking quickly for injury. The baby stirred, whimpering, then opened his eyes. His small face lit up with recognition. "He's cold," Chloe reported, voice thick with relief. "Hungry too, I expect. But otherwise—" James pulled Taya's shawl from his saddlebag. He'd saved it from the wagon fire. They wrapped it around the child, its familiar scent seeming to comfort him. Little Eli grabbed James's finger with surprising strength. Judson appeared in the doorway, rifle ready. "Pike?" "Shot himself more or less," James said. "Ricochet caught him clean through. He won't get far with that wound." "God's justice comes in many forms," the preacher said quietly. "We should head back before full dark." Outside, the first stars were appearing in the deep blue sky. Their horses waited patiently in the draw, ready for the long ride home. James helped Chloe mount with the baby, then swung up himself. Little Eli was already asleep against Chloe's chest, one tiny hand still clutching the fringe of his mother's shawl. In that moment, watching them in the starlight, James felt a peace he hadn't known since before the war. They turned their horses north, leaving Pike's blood darkening the red earth behind them. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, a lonely sound that seemed to echo the justice of the night. The moon rose to light their way home, as if God himself had hung a lamp in the darkness. They rode steadily through the cool night air, 3 riders and a sleeping child, guided by stars and faith toward whatever dawn might bring. The wagon creaked slowly through the mountain passes, taking 2 full days to reach Taos. Little Eli dozed peacefully against Chloe's shoulder, while James guided the borrowed team carefully over the rough trail. When they arrived, Sister Clara met them at the mission gate. "Broder's failing fast," she whispered. "He's been asking for the child." They found the rancher in his bedroom, propped up on pillows, his face gray and sunken, his eyes fixed on little Eli as Chloe brought the baby close. "My son," Broder whispered, touching the infant's cheek with trembling fingers. Tears rolled down his weathered face. "I was wrong, so wrong. The shame of denying my own blood." Reverend Judson appeared with papers in hand. Broder signed them with shaking strokes, naming James as the child's legal guardian. "You're a better man than me, Kearney," he said. "Raise him proud of both his bloodlines." The old rancher slipped away before dawn, peaceful at last. As the sun rose, fat snowflakes began drifting down, covering the ground in fresh white. James and Chloe stood together on the mission steps, while the church bell tolled slowly across the valley. One by one, townspeople approached, heads bowed. They carried baskets of food, warm blankets, and gifts for the baby, simple offerings of acceptance and regret. "The snow makes everything new again," Chloe said softly, watching the pure white cover yesterday's tracks. James nodded, feeling the weight of forgiveness settle like blessing upon them all. Spring painted the valley in tender greens as dawn broke over the Sangre de Cristo foothills. The morning air held a gentle warmth, so different from that bitter March snowstorm. James Kearney stood beneath the young cottonwood tree, its new leaves whispering in the breeze, while Chloe cradled little Eli close. Reverend Judson opened his Bible, worn leather creaking. Around them, townsfolk gathered in a respectful half-circle near Taya's grave, marked by its circle of stones. The creek bubbled softly nearby, free now from winter's grip. "We gather to baptize this child in the light of God's morning," Judson began, his voice carrying clear across the meadow. "In doing so, we honor both his mothers, one in heaven, one here on earth." James took the baby, now sturdy and alert at 3 months old, into his arms. Chloe's tears fell freely as Judson spoke both names with careful dignity. Elias Begay Kearney. As the sun crested the eastern ridge, James lifted his son toward its rays. The light caught the water droplets on the baby's brow, turning them to gold. A lark's sweet song pierced the silence, echoing off the valley walls. "Your mother's wish is fulfilled, little one," James whispered. "You'll always see the sunrise." The townsfolk bowed their heads, humbled by the mercy of the moment. Here, where death had led to life, where hatred had transformed to love, spring's renewal touched them all. Early summer painted the valley in wildflowers as James and Chloe exchanged vows in the whitewashed church. Reverend Judson's eyes twinkled as he pronounced them husband and wife, little Eli cooing from Sister Clara's arms. With funds from Broader's estate and Judson's guidance, they purchased a modest spread north of Taos. The weathered cabin sat proud on a gentle rise, its windows facing the sunrise. James worked from dawn to dusk, replacing worn boards and fixing the stone chimney. His calloused hands, once used to wagon reins, now shaped a home. Chloe transformed the bare earth around their porch. She planted a climbing rose bush, its tender shoots reaching toward the sky. "For every grave, there must be bloom," she said softly, thinking of Taya's resting place beneath the cottonwood. Their evening settled into sweet rhythm. Eli took his first wobbly steps across the plank floor while James steadied him. After supper, they gathered around the lamp, Chloe reading scripture while James mended harness. The official papers arrived from Santa Fe, confirming Eli's inheritance of his mother's grazing lands. Each night, peace wrapped around them like a warm blanket. Their small farm flourished. Hens scratched in the yard, sage bloomed in the fields, and love grew deeper with each passing day. Autumn painted the ridge in amber and gold. James woke while stars still glittered overhead, saddling his horse in the cool darkness. Little Eli, now nearly 2 years old, sat bundled against his chest as they rode toward the cottonwood, where Taya rested. The morning air carried the scent of sage and pine. James dismounted carefully, lifting Eli down beside him. Together they gathered late-blooming wildflowers, purple asters and yellow sunflowers that dotted the hillside. At Taya's grave, marked by weathered stones, James laid the bright bouquet. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice gentle on the wind. "Your boy is loved." As if understanding the moment's importance, Eli stood quietly beside him. The sky began to lighten, painting the eastern horizon in rose and pearl. Eli pointed one small finger toward the gathering dawn. "Son," he said clearly, his first word ringing like a bell across the ridge. James smiled, tears gathering in his eyes. Taya's final wish echoed in his heart, fulfilled in ways he never expected. When they returned home, Chloe waited on the porch, the smell of coffee and biscuits drifting from the open door. Her laughter welcomed them as Eli rushed to her arms. Morning light caught the simple wooden cross above their door, making it glow. James watched his family, feeling the weight of grace. He buried the past, he thought, and what rose instead was love. The three of them stood together in the golden morning, their faith as steady as the mountains, their love bridging all distances. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.